On May 24, 1970, the USSR embarked on a project that would later become known as the Kola Super Deep Borehole. Long abandoned, it still exists today, reaching a depth of about 41,000 feet. Whether it was drilled for scientific purposes or something else, the Kola borehole isn't the first time Russians dug deeper than necessary. Several abandoned and unguarded wells like this one can still be found in the remote corners of Russia. Descending into such a hole was the biggest mistake of my life. A year ago, my work took me to a small fishing village in Siberia, a tiny place with a couple of hundred residents, most of whom hunted and fished for a living. Working as a scientist had put me in awkward situations before. My grasp of Russian was far from perfect, and besides our team, only 2 people spoke English, which was a real challenge. Still, with the right attitude and a bottle of vodka, the locals became some of the friendliest people I've ever met. I enjoyed the company of the local police sergeant, Vadim, who had at least a basic grasp of English. Mostly, his job involved escorting drunk people home after major binges. Truth be told, he often participated rather than dispersed them. Naturally, we became good friends. We enjoyed life in this small, insane world, cut off from civilization. That was until the 9th month after our arrival, when a 7-year-old girl from the village, Daria, went missing. She was last seen with friends near an abandoned building that locals thought was an old Soviet-era mine. It had been deserted for over 40 years, but remained popular with the kids. That day, the mine was found open. Behind the broken doors was a passage leading to a vast room filled with old equipment, in the middle of which was a huge black hole. The hole was about 50 feet in diameter, and its depth was unfathomable. A lift platform hovered over the center of the pit, the kind used to descend into mines. All that could be seen from the edge of the hole was an endless dark abyss. Daria apparently had fallen in. I knew then she was dead. Falling from such a height, even into water, almost always ends in death. However, the other kids insisted that Daria was calling for help after she fell, giving her distraught mother false hope. I saw Vadim gather people for a rescue operation for the first time. Calling professional rescuers was futile. Even if they sent someone, they'd arrive too late. Having some experience in this area and first aid skills, I volunteered, as did my colleague Jim. While mechanics tried to revive the old equipment, I attached a weight to a cord and tried to gauge the hole's approximate depth. But even with all the ropes tied together, dropping about 900 feet, it didn't reach the bottom. Hours later, the mechanics announced the lift was ready to descend. They also found some old protective suits and documentation in the room. According to it, the atmospheric pressure at the bottom became quite high, and the temperature rose to 150 Celsius. I was sure we'd find nothing but the body of a little girl. "Ready?" Vadim asked us. The suits were clearly not made for our build, chafing even in places I couldn't imagine. We climbed into the lift, protected by a rusted holy mesh. Besides old flashlights, we were given a radio to communicate with the surface. "We're ready, lower us," Jim said. The descent began. The noise from the gears echoed off the well's walls. There was a small depth indicator on the lift platform. The descent was incredibly slow, no more than 1.5 feet per second. Still, the changes in the atmosphere were already noticeable. 150 feet. Darkness had already engulfed us. Our weak flashlights barely pierced it. "Think this is dark? Wait till winter comes, then you'll see real darkness," Vadim joked with his characteristic gloomy humor. Jim and I forced a smile. "Could you check the radio, Vadim?" I asked. "It works, don't worry," he replied. 500 feet. 10 minutes into our descent, the radio crackled for the first time. Due to interference and my poor Russian, I couldn't make out a word. "What was that?" I asked. "They asked how deep we've gone." Shouldn't we be able to hear their voices from above? It's only 500 feet, Jim questioned. You're right. This is strange, Vadim replied. It's possible we didn't hear their conversations because of the noise from the old lift and Jim pacing back and forth on the platform. Very strange, Vadim muttered to himself. Something was clearly wrong. I had never seen him so worried. Guys, is it just me or is it getting hot in here? Yeah, I'm sweating buckets. 1,500 feet. Help! A child's scream came from somewhere deep below. It was in Russian. Did you hear that? I asked. Hear what? Someone calling for help from below. I didn't hear anything. I gestured for silence and listened closely. Soon, the scream came again. Help! The same voice, but slightly louder. There, again. Yes, I heard it, Vadim said. Wait, they're calling for help. You hear it too? Yes, but in English. It wasn't unusual for children to pick up a word or two of English during our visits. But the idea that a little girl from the Siberian wilderness could know this word didn't make sense. Vadim shouted as loud as he could, but no one responded. Damn, can this thing go any faster? 4,000 feet. About an hour had passed since we last saw light from the surface. After the voices we heard, silence followed. The heat gave me a terrible headache. If someone was really calling us from below, we would have reached them by now. Guys, I see light, Vadim shouted. What are you talking about? Light down there, look. He was jumping in place, pointing into the darkness. There's nothing there, Vadim, Jim said. How can you not see it? It's so bright. I looked at Jim, confused. The first thought was that Vadim had lost his mind from the heat and darkness. 5,000 feet. No one had spoken since Vadim told us about the light. Our morale was sinking faster than the lift. My headache was nearly killing me. Suddenly, the lift stopped and violently shook. A sudden halt momentarily pinned me to the floor. A second later, I came to and saw Jim lying next to me. However, Vadim was nowhere to be seen. Jimmy, are you okay? I shook his shoulder, mumbling something. He got up. Damn, what happened? I don't know, but Vadim's gone. What? Where could he have gone? I have no idea. He just vanished. We searched the lift. It was impossible to get out from here. The grid had a few holes, but Vadim couldn't have fit through them. Hey, I found the radio, Jim said. Try to contact the surface. He called for help, but only static came from the radio. We tried to shout for Vadim, no response. The lift continued to descend. Screw this, let's go back up. Jim's voice sounded pathetic. I pressed several buttons on the control panel. And how are we supposed to do that? This control panel is broken. Only the one up top worked. He started shouting to the people remaining on the surface, but we both knew no one could hear us down here. 11,000 feet. Our descent had lasted over 4 hours. The heat was getting stronger with every meter. I had fainted several times from dehydration, though I thought I had brought enough water. Why haven't they pulled us back up yet? Jim asked with a weakening voice. He was a bit older than me, so he was handling the heat much worse. I don't know. Is it even possible to go this deep underground? Jim didn't respond. He had passed out, but I didn't have the strength to revive him. I was ready to pass out again myself, but a strange sound resembling singing brought me back from the darkness. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard in Russian. Although I didn't understand a word, it sounded so soothing, so pure and innocent. Jimmy, oh, do you hear that? Someone singing, he mumbled in a half-asleep voice. Light appeared in the depth, and the singing grew louder. I see it. Light, I said. The lift stopped again. Jim disappeared without a trace, just like Vadim. But the light remained. A wonderful, warming light. It approached, and the closer it got, the calmer I felt. The light kept approaching until nothing was left but brightness. Then there was only emptiness. I woke up in a hospital a week later. Hunters found me somewhere in the forests of eastern Russia. I had no documents or items to prove my identity. Moreover, they claimed my story sounded at least insane. According to public records, such a borehole never existed, which didn't surprise me much, but when I dug deeper, I realized that even the village where I had lived for almost a year wasn't on any map. The past events had a negative impact on my mind, leaving several gaps in my memory. However, I managed to remember a few phone numbers of my colleagues. When I called them, all were disconnected or belonged to complete strangers. After a long investigation, I was allowed entry into the U.S. with temporary documents. Returning home, I was horrified to find that a complete stranger was living in my house. My neighbors didn't recognize me. I called my sister, but she had no idea who David was. She didn't know me. Friends, neighbors, relatives, nobody knew about me. I don't exist in this world, and I have no idea how to get back home. The Russians dug the shaft too deep, and only God knows what they reached.